Consider this, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bales Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome back to UNO. This week we're going to talk a little bit about how tight the budget is. No, not your budget, although I'm sure it is this time of year. We're going to talk about the state budget, which, I don't even know if crisis works. I don't even know if it's a big enough word. Maybe we can find the right words from our guest this week. Senator Pat Bourne represents District Number
8,
which is in the central or east central part of Omaha.
The Benson area.
Right. And Senator Nancy Thompson, we always likes to mention she's from Papillion, and she represents a good chunk of that area out there. I mean, where do you begin to find the words to say that over the next 2-year budgeting process, we have to cut $700 million, maybe more?
It's a significant problem. The governor has asked the fiscal staff to come in, or asked the agencies to come in with the budgets that were 90% of what they spent last year. And those numbers, if we adopted a 90% budget from last year, we'd still have about $80 million to cut. That's how significant the problem is. And
every budget item and every department is different in terms of its needs. I mean, you can't just say, even though the governor has said 10%, Nancy. I mean, there's still going to have to be some give and take, unless we do, like you mentioned. You heard the governor of Kentucky is letting prisoners out in droves because of state budgets.
I think the challenge is that Nebraska's budget, significant part, is for operations of those agencies, about $1 billion. And when we look at operations, those are people who patrol the roads to follow up on accidents and arrest criminals. They're taking care of veterans in nursing homes. They're taking care of people with acute mental illness. They're investigating child abuse. These are important functions of state government, and we're now to the point where we can't perform our core functions if we don't have this revenue. So the question is, what don't we do? Do we go to education and say education isn't important? Do we go to Health and Human Services and say that isn't important? That's where most of the state budget goes. We have some other options out there, but it's going to take a lot of little pieces being put together to get to that astronomical number.
By the way, we're sitting in a state institution right now, and we, with the budget cuts that we've had, we can't afford poinsettias. I want to give a special thanks, which I should have done at the top of the show, to the great folks at Rose Court, 129th and Maple and Eagle Run, and every year, even if our spirits might be a little low worrying about budget cuts, we always have our poinsettias. But back to the topic. This is just a huge, huge number.
Huge number.
I mean, I can't even begin to, you talk about services that have, I mean, there are some that just have to. I mean, we can't go to the State Patrol and say, okay, 10% of our officers, I mean, our coverage is probably tight even.
That's right.
In a good year.
And to follow up on what Nancy said, our budget in Nebraska is about $2.5 billion, of which about 70% is fixed. So you're looking at about a $900 million portion of the budget that's cuttable. And if our deficit is running at $700 million, you're looking at cutting out most of everything that is not fixed.
And an example of what Pat's talking about is, if you're an elderly person in Nebraska and you've run out of resources, you've sold your home, you're in a nursing home, and you've run out of money, you're eligible for our state Medicaid program. And that's a good thing. We want to take care of people when they are unable to take care of themselves. That's an obligation that government has chosen to fulfill. We as a state legislative body don't get to choose how many people that is. It doesn't matter whether to that individual person, whether we budget it or not, but we're going to get the bill for that person. And nursing home care is running probably in a lot of places about $4,000 a month. So we're talking about a lot of money that automatically goes to individuals because of their circumstances, because of their disability, because they're a child in a home that has no resources, and we want to make sure they're getting basic primary health care. So about $1 billion of our budget goes to those kinds of programs. About $1 billion of our budget goes in aid to local governments, schools, counties, cities, and other places, because we want to offset property tax and we want to support those things. So as Pat says, when you get down to the rest of our budget, which includes corrections and our acute care mental health hospitals and our Department of Environmental Quality and the fire marshal and everybody else, there's not enough money left in that pot. So either we have to go to those other programs and say we're not going to provide dental coverage to children that are low income, or we're not going to be able to operate all the campuses of a university system. Maybe the Board of Regents or the State College Board is going to have to say we're going to have to close something. We just have very, very difficult choices.
We are not the only state that is facing these things. I mean, and I'm sure that every legislature is, and it must be more difficult to cut with 2 houses at least. I think it's better with one. I don't know. It's going to be hard enough just to get one group to agree on things. But what I was thinking is there networking that goes on, or ideas? I mean, there are similar. Every states run differently. It's a different animal. But there are elderly people without resources in nursing homes, and there are.
The majority of states right now are having budget problems, and as a matter of fact, Nebraska is probably in the best shape, or I shouldn't say the best shape.
One of the better.
Yeah, we're in one of the better states fiscally. California is running about a $23 billion budget. I think Minnesota's in the $1 billion range. So I think while Nebraska has some significant problems, we're certainly not as bad off as many states.
Okay, so you're going to have to make some decisions, and taking 10% off everything isn't, that's a good place to start to look at it.
You bet.
But when you're talking about things, you mentioned dental care for Medicaid children that are on the Kids Connection program, or as an example of something that could be discussed and may well be discussed. How do you prioritize these possible cuts, and everybody's ox will be gored in a different way, and everybody's district will take more of a hit just because of the nature of the differences in our districts? I mean, how do you even begin this process? I mean, I should mention you're both on the Appropriations Committee,
right.
so you have a little credibility here.
Well, for me, I like to look at it as what are the values of the state? What do we value most? What are critical? Where do we start? So for most people, that starts with education. K-12 education and the ability of students to be able to graduate from our high schools and go to our universities and not be barred from doing that because they don't have the resources, or it's because it's unaffordable, because the future of the state depends upon the quality.
Or they go somewhere else because we have to cut programs or whatever. You don't want to lose them.
Most people, when you talk to them, will say education. We are a caring population of people. We don't want people to suffer. We want to take care of people with fragile health. That's an obligation in the Constitution of the state. So those is where we start. When you get into the gray areas, it's how many programs do we support because they're good ideas? How many things do we do to promote economic development? What do we do to help the agricultural community in the state? And that's where we get kind of off on another track of what is for the good of the state and what should we be spending taxpayer money on.
And don't you have a concern about short run versus long run when you make cuts? Now let's take economic development, where I think, especially if you live in this part of the state, you see we're at a pretty pivotal point in Omaha is going through some things that look really, really good, and I think are going to be really, really good. But if there's some stifling of some things going on maybe around us or whatever, that might affect the momentum. Also, the population decreases and problems at some of the greater Nebraska communities. If you cut programs, and I think they already are cutting programs that help some education, economic development, education and whatnot, I mean, those could affect them forever.
That's right. When you talk about looking long term, just go back to the Medicaid for a minute. After we had several special sessions this last year to deal with budget situation, and after all of our budget cuts, our spending increased by 0.5% over the biennium, which is not bad. But it's projected to grow at 7% in the first year of the biennium and 14% in the second year of the biennium, all because of entitlement spending. And
those kinds of things that you talked about you don't know how many are going to have to be in a nursing home.
Exactly. We heard some numbers on the floor of the legislature during the last debate that there's about 220,000 Nebraskans out of 1.7 million that are receiving some sort of state assistance. The only area of our spending, or the only area in state spending that's incurring significant growth, is entitlements and Medicaid. And as difficult as it may be, I think that we need to somehow look at what components of the Medicaid package
how broad it is,
exactly,
rather than cutting.
Exactly.
Just saying you can go and you can't go.
The federal government says, here's what you have to offer. And, we've had great times of prosperity here in Nebraska, and because of that, we've expanded what we've offered. So all of a sudden, instead of offering health insurance for catastrophic illnesses, now all of a sudden we have chiropractic coverage for Medicaid people and dental. And I'm not trying to be flippant or hard or difficult, but I think that those, when you talk about long-term solutions, that's kind of what we need, in my opinion. We need to look out long-term. We can't sustain 14% growth in Medicaid expenditure. There's a statistic that if we continue the way we are in terms of Medicaid spending, Medicaid will make up 80% of our budget in 15 years. That's a significant problem.
And couple that with the fact that although you had a glimmer of good news from the figures that reached the State Forecasting Board this month, that income tax revenues are up a little bit, the other revenues were down. We are still dealing with more unemployment than we're used to. Not huge numbers, but it's more than we're used to, which means more of those people may fall into those entitlement programs.
Absolutely. And then when you talk about income tax, we've not seen the results from the drought. I think
that's true.
Come the first or second quarter of next year, you're going to see the incomes from the rural population, the ag sector, you're going to see the income tax fall way off.
When they file those income tax returns. In fact, somebody was saying just yesterday, gee, I hope it doesn't snow a lot this winter. I said, no.
We need the water.
We need
the
moisture. That's right.
If you don't want to pay any more taxes, and if you want some people to be, at least be able to survive in Greater Nebraska, no, you pray for snow.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
We tend to forget how interrelated we really are, but so are our economies and our economic bases throughout the state.
Absolutely.
Education, you look at, and I hate to be kind of ethnocentric here, but Omaha School District, for instance, which recently has taken some hits, as many school districts have, in state aid education, and is concerned about some things they're trying to do, and tried to raise the lid on their allowable local taxing. They were planning on banging on the door for more money.
You bet.
As I'm sure some other school districts are.
Yeah.
What are the chances?
Well, there's zero, to be quite blunt.
It's Christmas, Nancy.
I'm sorry. Might as well be frank. There's no sense stringing people along to think there's any more money in a lot of these areas, and it's basically two policy decisions coupled on the issue of aid to education. One is that we want a strong educational system, and the state has an obligation, in its view, to fund part of that. The other is that we don't, as a state, like paying property tax very much. So unless the state's willing to pay some of that cost with sales and income tax, there isn't a way to offset it other than property tax. It's the only way schools have to support themselves. So we've put a new formula, relatively speaking, over the last 5 years into effect that has increased rapidly the amount of state appropriation for it. In the time I've been in the legislature, it's increased about $250 million. So that's another growing part. In addition to Medicaid, the state aid formula keeps growing because we're trying to offset some of our property tax issues. So if we take away that funding for the cities, for the school districts, we're going to have to lift the lid, in my view, that's on them that says you can't raise property tax. That was the trade-off. It was a tax shift.
Absolutely.
And so that a lot of what we can do as a state in this budget crisis is to pass the problem off to other people. Even if we decide we want to cut the Medicaid program, the hospitals are going to have indigent people show up who can't afford to pay, and that's going to fall back on the people who do pay.
Yeah.
Well, the counties and also people who pay private insurance, because the hospital has to be able to pay its own bills. So when we say, oh, well, we're not going to cover dental for certain people, let's just use that as an example. So the kids don't get their dental coverage, or we'll take them for example. They don't do very well in school, they're acting out their problems, they show up in an emergency room. There's some places in the state where we can't even get dentists to take Medicaid patients because we pay so poorly. So we have choices, like Pat said. We can either take people off the rolls, we can pay the people who take care of them less, or we can provide a smaller package. And some of the things
Keep more of the core of each one of these programs. In other words, what is the thing that makes this program exist for? You know, because it's a federal mandate and we have to do this, or this is what we want to do. We just can't we can't widen that circle, or we have to bring that circle back into the core.
And it's a the circle that we've widened, we've done for good reasons. For example, we decided to cover pregnant women on Medicaid because babies will be born healthier, we won't have low birth weight babies.
We've had some problems with our infant mortality rate.
And that's one of the ideas that's on the list, is to stop covering that. And so somebody's going to pay in some fashion for what the state does.
Sure. All things, everything Nancy said is true. It's interesting how interrelated everything is. When you talk about the state aid formula, and what has happened is that the state has said you can only charge $1 per 100 of assessed value on a home, and then that loss in revenue to the counties we've made up with sales and income tax, basically state aid. And the idea is to lower property tax. Well, at the time that state aid went up from $180 million, 8 or 9 years ago, to $640 million today, the property taxes have gone up 50-some% in Douglas County, all because of valuation increases. So, I think the state aid formula was put in with the best of intentions, but I don't believe that it's really worked out.
But that was also at the time when the valuations were too low, and so it was a combination of things. And the cities and the counties then didn't have. I'm sure taxpayers felt they had a windfall, but in reality they didn't have that huge. But they were able to do some things. They were able to make some progress and do some of the things like Omaha has done.
That's absolutely true. But now we're at a point where state aid to schools is about $670 million. So if we talk about cutting some of that back to put it back on the local property tax rolls, well, we've already increased those, or the counties have already increased those, even though we put in levy limits. So it's hard to go back. It's hard to put that back on the property.
You're going to have a revolution if.
That's right.
If it gets, it's the. I use this whole thing, which is horribly outdated and politically incorrect, but the husband comes home from work, kicks the wife kicks, and this doesn't really happen. But it's going to have that kind of.
You didn't get to the dog.
And the cat and the mouse. But it truly is a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
Right.
And one of the things that we have not done very well in the legislature, I think, is we have not made many structural changes. We've cut $300 or $400 million out of the budget in real cuts, but we haven't made any ongoing structural changes to kind of decrease the size or scope of our spending.
For instance, I'm not saying this is not what you would necessarily do, but give me a hypothetical.
Well, when I talk about Medicaid, and again, I'm not trying to say, to kick off pregnant women or kids or anything, but again, we have 220,000 Nebraskans on some form of public assistance. To me, the Medicaid program is supposed to provide health insurance to those who are absolutely unable to provide it. And it seems to me that when we have 1 out of 8 people in Nebraska on Medicaid or some form of Medicaid, that we've exceeded the scope of what that program was designed to do.
Now, would you have any leeway in lowering, I don't know how to say this, there's an income threshold of, lowering that threshold. Can you do that under the federal government? And is that a good thing to do? Because I've read just new figures that have come out on state, the average salaries by county.
Right.
And looking at those, some of them are pretty scary.
You bet. That's true.
Actually, in the special session, we did do that, and we have about 15,000 people who are going off the program. A lot of essentially low-income mothers, working families, but that tends to be single moms and children. But out of the numbers Pat's talking about, there's been slight adjustment because of the cuts. But if it's about 10.5% of Nebraskans, and if you look at that 10.5 out of 100 people, 7 of those are children who are on the program, and the rest, 1.5 will be disabled, blind and disabled. 1 person plus
So
is
where do
elderly.
you get out that little red
Exactly.
pen, and who
Right.
are you going
That's-
to?
But the
that's the
reverse is what it's not the 7 kids who cost the big amount of money. It's the elderly and disabled who
Right.
take the majority of that. So
Which we have a chunk of.
right.
And,
so
and an
you-
aging
Yeah,
population
we
as
and
well.
an aging population, and so
So that's
you
not going to
can-
get any better.
you have to figure out how, when you cut people off the rolls, if they can get insurance or be insured
Well,
or
and besides
find
that,
another way.
let's take the example you gave of nursing home. You're either in the nursing home or you're not. So if it costs $4,000 a month, I mean, you can't cut it back to $3,000 a month because then they would be out of the nursing home.
Well,
And
we-
so it's
we
some of those
squeeze
things
the
are all
providers. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
we
know,
can
and
we
you
can take
have.
money from, and it's not
But
the right way to
but
go.
what I'm
because-
saying, it's not where you're just moving little numbers around on a thing and it equates
Yeah,
to
but,
people.
but consider this. I mean, we have
That's the name of our show, by the way.
Is there?
Consider this.
We have a lot of our population is aging, and we have a significant portion of our Medicaid dollars spent on nursing home expenditure. Well, we have a system here where a person can divest themselves of assets and then just in a few years get on Medicaid for purposes of paying for their nursing home.
Well, on the other hand, have we been, since you bring up this example, have we been aggressive in changing our policies to allow helping out with at-home health care so that it doesn't again become an all or nothing where they have to
right, but
leave their home and
We've been aggressive with trying to develop other levels of care,
That-
moving
assisted living.
moving some of the nursing homes in Nebraska into assisted living facilities, cutting down the numbers and doing some
so
of those
we've been
things.
making those kinds of strides
Right.
all along.
But,
and
but what Pat's talking about, I hear a lot from legislators because of the fact that there's a worry, particularly when families are transferring wealth, and in Nebraska, a lot of that wealth is land, and so the next generation would like to be able to.
so by
stay.
divesting, you don't mean just using up the equity in your home to live. You mean by the estate shell game.
You
And
bet.
I don't mean that people don't deserve to pass on their land, but that there is some of that.
And some of this is federal federal things. They aren't things that we are going to be able to do
That's
as a
true.
state. But there's a frustration out there with some of that.
A lot of this is driven by the federal government, and there's look-back requirements in that. But I do believe that we can tighten up those. I don't think that it's reasonable for, a millionaire to divest themselves of their assets and then 2-3 years later go into the nursing home and have society pick up their bills when their kids have had a windfall. That doesn't seem equitable to me.
With all the states, and you throughout before the show, 40 states are in serious financial crisis,
Yeah.
maybe more. Maybe they'll find out soon that they are. Is there going to be a push, and the states should have some lobbying power, particularly I think with the Republican administration, who didn't like unfunded mandates and some of the things to I know it's push me, pull you, and something's always gonna, you move one thing, but to get the feds to back off on some things?
I think there's been a big effort so far. The problem is that the feds, they could move, for example, the Medicaid percentage that the states have to contribute. They could shift that formula. And even moving at 1% would just be a wonderful help to the states.
Or
But
maybe
it's-
require lower thresholds or...
Yeah, there's a lot that could be done by the federal government, but they're all caught up in their little game of La La Land, wanting to give tax cuts and
That's,
roll all
I'm
these things
glad
out.
you brought that
they're
up, and this is
paying
not
attention.
a partisan question.
No.
But the issue of tax cuts right now,
Yeah.
and I know, I'm sure our president, Mr. Bush, has the best intentions. I try to always, no matter who my politician is that I'm thinking about or dreaming about or cursing, they're not doing it just for political reasons. They think it will help stimulate the economy, et cetera, et cetera. But is this the time?
Well, nobody's really talking about the impact that the federal cuts have on states. And most states' income taxes are tied to the federal form.
Right.
And so any cuts that are made at the federal level have significant impacts on the state. And you saw when the estate tax was modified at the federal level, many states uncoupled And but nobody's really talking about the dramatic impact that those tax cuts that are coming are going to have on the states. It's a huge
your
problem.
State Officials Association or your State Legislators Association ought to bring some of that out, because I don't think people understand the connections and whatnot. What do you think is going to be the biggest? We just have a few minutes left, and personally, because I know you're not quite the same people, you're not cut out of the same mold. If you could say, I would do this tomorrow, wave my magic legislative wand and get everybody to agree with me, and it'd be legal to do it.
Sure.
What would you? And I'm not holding you to
No,
this.
I understand. I mean, I wish that we could go back about 10 or 15 years. And as I mentioned,
So do I.
Like this, I know.
Gravity has been really tough on me.
I meant in terms of spending. I mean, as it's worked out, I think that the state aid formula has not worked out very well. But I think it's almost to the point where it's going to be very difficult to switch or to go back because of the way that the taxes have gone up in the counties. I think that we spent a lot of time in the interest of property tax relief shifting stuff to the state government, expenditure to the state government that I wish we hadn't done. And now, when the state's in trouble, well, the municipalities and counties are in trouble as well. So it's very difficult to shift that back.
Do you wish there was a way to find it as equitable a change so that it wouldn't be felt by both one side or the other too much,
Exactly.
particularly the state budget? Nancy?
I think we need reform of our tax policy, and we've needed it for a long time.
How so?
Nebraska has a very narrow sales tax base compared to its surrounding
So you're talking
states. And
food, maybe?
I'm
And-
talking, no, not so. You could do food with a tax credit. That's a possibility. In the discussions we've had the last few years, we pretty much took food and.
So who's exempt that you'd zap?
Well, for one thing, we have, well, let me give you the example us legislators always like to give. In our state, we exempt bull semen, aviation fuel. I could give you a big list. It's mainly agribusiness and business. And it was done for various industries to help them along and make them more competitive. And a lot of those
We
taxes.
said aviation fuel. Do other
Aviation fuel?
states tax
No.
aviation fuel?
We have some ways we get some revenue there, but we're the only state that doesn't have a specific tax on aviation fuel. It's about time that we take all these exemptions, and the people have been working for years to try to address this, and I'm not one of, I'm kind of the B team on this, and there've been a lot of people working on it, but it's very hard for us to go back once you let the genie out of the bottle and say, oh, well, wait a second, we made a mistake 3 years ago.
But you tax services
We did some of
time
it.
Very
around.
narrow. Very
A
narrow.
very
It was
small
very narrow,
piece.
and I have to pay now tax to get my hair done.
No,
And-
well.
And no, I'm not complaining. I'm saying, I think that I can live with that. I don't like tax increases,
Right.
but I can live with that if other people have to live with what tax increases on what they.
And the other things that I would do in addition to that is I think we really do need to take a serious look at our economic development incentives, such as LB 775
Right.
was, because that was passed a long time ago, and I think there needs to be some accountability that we're creating jobs that pay and that those jobs have health insurance, that people can survive on those
Yeah, if you're going to get
jobs.
some credits, take some of the burden off the state by providing some things. So,
Absolutely.
well, we've run out of time. I will only say that as the holiday goes, and I say my holiday prayers, you all will be included in them.
Thank you.
We
because you
appreciate
have a
that.
huge job ahead. Senator Patrick Bourne and Senator Nancy Thompson, good luck in the upcoming session, and have a safe and wonderful holiday season, all of you who watch. And if you didn't get to see it, go to unotv.unomaha.edu and watch the show. It's just a little box, but you can still watch it. Take care. Don't, you're still on camera.